After 5 years of marriage, my husband became a quiet, homely man, and that suited me completely. Our jobs, of course, meant that we sometimes had to socialize a little, meet colleagues, or attend some events, but always after that my husband and I returned to our corner. At such moments, I experienced real peace. The world around us seemed to disappear, and only he, I, and the comfort of our apartment remained. From time to time, I came across interesting or even funny mistakes in student work. I immediately shared them with my husband, although he always claimed that he was not particularly educated, but it was these blunders that became for us not only a reason for laughter, but also the subject of our conversations. He always understood exactly what I thought was funny and laughed with me, as if he himself couldn't help but appreciate the absurdity of certain situations. At such moments, I realized how deep our connection was. Despite all the differences, we were on the same wavelength, and this brought me great satisfaction. When my work was completed, I went to the kitchen to prepare him a light snack, nothing complicated, because he did not require great culinary feats, and I preferred simplicity in such moments. I would usually make a cheese sandwich or just put a few slices of cheese on a plate with some crackers, giving him a short but tasty break from watching sports. Sometimes I added another cup of hot tea, which went perfectly with the evening atmosphere. With a kettle in my hands, I returned to our living room, settled into a chair next to him, choosing a comfortable position so as to be close, but not interfere with his absorbed viewing. I wasn't a big sports fan. The idea of watching endless matches or tournaments didn't excite me, but I knew very well that it meant a lot to him. He loved everything: football, cricket, golf, tennis, rugby, and sometimes more exotic sports, which I only heard about for the first time when he began to discuss them. He always sincerely enjoyed every minute of the match, watching every move of the players, strategy, and even general trends in the sport. Usually, noticing that I was sitting next to him, he would ask me if I wanted to watch something else, suggesting that we switch to something more neutral that might interest us both. But I rarely agreed. I liked to be near him, even if silently. I learned to determine by his face and gaze how much he was absorbed in what was happening on the screen. If his attention was completely focused on the game, I did not disturb him with suggestions. When his gaze became more distracted, or he began to get distracted by conversations, I could gently suggest changing the channel. But even in those moments, our conversations weren't tense or intrusive. Rather, they were simple but meaningful interactions where each knew the other valued each other's silence and company. His only bad hobby, so to speak, is playing whist on Fridays. I was never very good at cards, frankly, so I was rarely invited to play. The game was usually played by Joffrey, my husband, Bob, and Marjorie, a couple in their early 40s who lived just a few hundred yards from us, and Calvin, the owner of a local plumbing company who did a lot of work with the building supplies company that my husband runs. Husband. Each week the game took place at a different person's house, as the hosts provided food and drink 2 out of 4 times at Bob and Marjorie's, so I had 3 out of 4 weeks to relax and watch what I wanted on the TV. They were usually old westerns. Don't ask why, I just love all those movies with Randolph Scott, John Wayne, and Audie Murphy, probably because they're uncomplicated, often touchingly romantic amidst all the gunplay, and usually have a morally justifiable ending. When the game was at our house, I would focus on preparing and serving the food, keeping everyone stocked with beer, wine, or whatever, and generally trying to stay out of the way. However, I was always a little wary when I was alone with Calvin, because a couple of times, usually when the drinks were a little looser, he tried to seduce me. It wasn't serious, but he liked to show up in the kitchen to help me with drinks when they took a break from the game. He had a way of making comments about my appearance that were almost revealing, but just barely. I could handle it. Most women are taught how to react to these things from an early age, especially if they're quite attractive. And this is how I would describe myself: not great, but not bad either. At the moment of which I speak, I was just beginning to realize the horrors of the approaching 30 years. We were married for 5 years, and I took care of my fitness. I'm only 160 centimeters and have a slim build, meaning I have to wear a well-padded bra to look like a decent size B. but that goes well with a small waist and shapely hips, which are maintained by regular gym sessions. My legs are okay, but nothing special. What I do have is a pretty face, often described as cute, and my only real vanity is long, thick blonde hair. I'm not much of a flirt, hey, who doesn't flirt a little, right? It's human nature, but I enjoy receiving compliments on my appearance, even though they often make me blush. However, comments from Calvin were sometimes more than just flirting and often made me feel uncomfortable. I used to be terrified when he showed up in the kitchen while I was cutting sandwiches or taking homemade pies, sausage rolls, or quiches out of the oven, because he always managed to appear at the exact moment when I was bending over and saying something about my butt. Oh yes, I can't wait to put this in my mouth, and the food is fine too. That's what he considered humor, or, I guess I need to borrow your frying gloves to handle something this hot. At first, I just ignored him or tried to laugh, but the remarks became increasingly personal and sexual until I had to politely tell him that I didn't appreciate such jokes. Did this help? No, it didn't help. On the contrary, they have become even worse. If you ever need a brownie in the oven, I'm available if Joffrey can't handle it. It was one of the softer jokes. This helped me understand why he had already been divorced twice. I told my husband about all this and how it made me feel, but he just said that there was no point in being such a prude. Calvin, they say, is harmless, and these are just jokes. Apparently, I need to relax and stop making a big deal out of a molehill. This was all well and good, but the next time we had them, Calvin actually snuck up behind me and grabbed my chest. Of course, I broke away, and in a quiet, rough voice, I didn't want to create a scene in front of everyone. I told him not to touch me anymore. Later, when I told Joffrey about this, he just laughed. I couldn't believe it. His friend grabbed my chest, and my husband just fucking laughed. That's just the way Calvin is, he said. He's a bachelor, and he has some kind of passion for you. He always tells the guys at work that I have a very pretty wife. It's a joke. He jokes that there were no teachers like you at his school. You know, jokes about how he would like to get into the penalty box and stay in custody with you. Something like that. He's probably upset. He recently broke up with his girlfriend, so I think he's probably hunting for adult videos on the internet almost every night. So I should just let him paw me and not do anything, I demanded, feeling my usually well-controlled temper begin to bubble dangerously close to the surface. I didn't say that, Jeffrey replied. Look, I'll talk to him and try to make sure this doesn't happen again, okay? You better talk, I insisted, because if this happens again, I won't come to your card parties. I will go to my mother until I am sure that everyone has already left. It was a nasty irritation that continued to simmer for a while, but apparently Jeffrey talked to him because Calvin actually stopped coming into the kitchen. In fact, there were a couple of times over the next few months where he couldn't even make it to the card nights because he seemed to be in a new relationship. I was grateful for this. It's not that I didn't like Calvin, he's generally a normal guy when he's not drinking. In fact, he is a very attractive and fit man, the kind you wouldn't date for long without a pretty girl hanging on his arm. But the simple truth is that I already get enough sexual innuendo in the staff room that I don't really want it in my house on my own time. The only bad thing about his absence was that I had to play whist with my husband, and as I said, I'm not very good at that game, certainly not to the level of the very competitive Bob and Marjorie. The quarrel began in mid-October. It was a gray and dreary Friday afternoon followed by a cold and rainy night. I stayed late at the school, talking to parents concerned that their daughter was being given too much homework, and then to another mother who suspected her son was being bullied. When I arrived home and reheated the dinner I had prepared the day before, I was in a significant rush to get everything done. When the game was at Calvin's, it was usually Marjorie who brought the food, and he made up for it by providing drinks. I guess I half assumed that since he now had a girlfriend, there was no need to do this, but at breakfast I was told that the relationship was over. Then during the day I received a message from my husband that Marjorie had a cold. Unsurprisingly, half of my students were absent due to some kind of flu, which meant that I would have to take over all the food and participate in the game. and since Calvin lived 2 miles away, I would have to drive too. I admit I was not in the best mood. This was made worse by the fact that I had to stop at the store to pick up some things, and there were huge queues at the checkout. And on top of that, I discovered that even though I had put the laundry in the washing machine before leaving in the morning, somehow I forgot to launch it. I figured I could put my jeans and sweater in the dryer, but that obviously wouldn't work. In the end, not wanting to wear anything too revealing in Calvin's company, I chose an old denim skirt that buttoned in the front just below the knee, and a loose, bulky sweater that was so unfeminine that Gabby Hayes could wear it. Once Bob climbed into the back seat of my car, and my husband settled in the front with his usual complaint about the space being too small, we were off. Since there was no Marjorie to chat with, the ride seemed very quiet, and in order to somehow start a conversation, I asked, "What happened to Calvin's girlfriend?" "She returned to her husband," Bob said completely innocently, and I was surprised. "You didn't say she was married," I told my husband. "Didn't say. Apparently I forgot," he answered rather dispassionately, but Bob was more frank. "Yes, he met her when he was installing new plumbing. They say it was attraction at first sight," he grinned. "When her husband found out, I think she tried to convince him that it was something she had to get out of her head, but as soon as he started talking about divorce, she ran to him and dropped Calvin like a hot brick." "Really? I thought he was pretty." Harmless," I said, trying to sound as naive as possible. "Don't believe it, honey," Bob said. "He is a real devil when it comes to married women. Says he prefers them because they don't talk about what they do. I think his infidelities caused both of his divorces." "Really? Has he ever tried to hit on Marjorie?" I asked, noticing that Jeffrey looked a little awkward. "I can guarantee that I would have known about everything if that had happened," he replied, and then continued. "He's a generally normal guy. He just can't resist trying with married women if they're even a little bit cute." By that time, we had arrived at the place, and Calvin was waiting at the door while the men carried the bulk of the food into the house. I walked over with the last plate, and Calvin opened the door, asking what was on it. When I said they were chicken wings, he winked, grinned lasciviously, and said he was more of a legs and breasts guy. Apparently, his recent relationship has passed. Of course, I was replacing Marjorie in the game, which meant I was Bob's partner, sitting across from him at the small square table in Calvin's living room. My husband was sitting to my right, and Calvin, his partner, was to my left. Bob was supposed to deal first, but before he did, he announced, "Okay, since Patsy cooked all the food and brought us here, I think it's only fair that she has a couple of drinks, and then you take us home. What do you say, Jeffrey?" "I don't mind too much," I said quickly. "Damn it, I'm already a bad gambler, and with a few drinks, I thought I'd become a completely inappropriate player. Plus, I knew that Jeffrey liked to have a couple of beers during the game, but Bob wasn't so easy to put aside." "Okay then," he said. "You and your husband will cut the cards, and the one who loses will remain sober." I was about to say I didn't want to, but my husband laughed and agreed, probably thinking it was a great way to guarantee Bob, and I would win, and soon we had a shuffled deck in front of us. "Ladies first," someone said, and although reluctantly, I divided the deck and turned over the card the 4 of diamonds. I was relieved, thinking that she would be easily defeated, but as often happens, Jeffrey laid down 2 clubs. After a couple of seconds, Calvin placed a glass of Bacardi and Coke in front of me with ice and a slice of lemon. My first hand turned out to be very good, and it seemed that my partner did too. We won it, and then we won the second one. I quickly realized that Bob was an excellent player, and by acting rationally, I helped him win the first round of games with a 4-1 score. I've never been on the winning side, and I felt pretty elated, especially when I saw my husband blowing his lips a little. I finished my drink, which was immediately replaced, and we continued. The second game was more intense, 3-2, but I was happy with the result. By this time I was on my third Bacardi. 3 is always my limit, and I knew I was starting to feel the effects because it seemed much stronger than the previous 2. I realized I needed to slow down, so I left some in the glass as the game ended with another narrow win for Bob and me. Apparently, it was time to take a break, and without thinking about it, I went into Calvin's small kitchen to start peeling the film off the food. Usually, I can manage 3 drinks, but this time I felt like I was starting to get a little confused, not drunk, but a little tipsy. And when my clumsiness caused me to drop one of the wings on the floor, I actually laughed as I crouched down to pick it up, intending to put it back on the plate and not say anything. Yes, I know the so-called 5-second rule is a myth, but not when you are tipsy. Let me take it. I heard Calvin's voice right next to me, and before I knew what was happening, his large hand grabbed the wing. I looked up and was just in time to see him smiling and taking a bite, and as I tried to straighten up, I suddenly fell backwards. I can't say what exactly I might have looked like or what he might have seen, only he knows. But I do know that several buttons on the front of my skirt had come off, and that the back of my head had cracked violently against the refrigerator door, adding to my confusion, and that I felt overwhelmed and a little confused. I realized that I was lying with my legs spread out on the tile, but I couldn't get my arms to work to get up. It was predictable that Calvin would start helping me, and the way he did it was also quite predictable. Instead of standing behind me, which would have been a simple enough solution, he stood between my legs, leaned over, put his arm around me, and simply lifted me up as if I weighed nothing. Okay, if he had wrapped both arms around my waist, it wouldn't have been so bad, but Calvin clearly wasn't going to miss this opportunity. As soon as his left hand wrapped around my waist and began to lift me up, his right hand immediately went under my butt and lifted me completely off the floor. Imagine the picture if you can. A handsome and very fit man is standing in his kitchen, and a slightly stunned woman is holding her hands on his shoulders. Notice I said for and not around, while he has one hand on her waist, and the other is on her butt, and her legs are hanging in the air, and when she tries to move away, he presses her lips to his and begins to kiss. Do you understand the picture? Okay, now imagine that you are this woman's husband, and when you hear a noise, you walk into the kitchen and see exactly this. How do you think you would react? Let's make a couple of assumptions. The first option is that you think that the guy your wife was complaining about is trying to take advantage of her, and you are angry with him. You will demand that he put her down, perhaps demand an explanation, and then drag her out of there with at least a stern warning to the man about his behavior. That would be reasonable. The second option is that you would immediately think that something was happening or is happening behind your back. You would become very upset, perhaps start an argument, or even a fight before leaving the room, or, as in the first option, immediately take your wife out of there. This would be understandable, even if not as reasonable as the first option. I don't think most men would choose the third option, the one where they just watch for a few seconds, grinning like a cat who just saw an uncovered jar of cream, and then say, "It's okay, don't rush into eating, whenever you're ready," and take a couple of cans of beer, quietly closing the door behind them, leaving and returning to another room. But that's exactly what my husband did. By that time, I had already come to my senses a little and realized what was happening. I jerked my face away from Calvin's breath, which smelled of whiskey, and began to try to escape. He was a very strong man, and I, as I already said, was quite fragile, and he held me so tightly that it was difficult for me to even breathe, let alone scream or say something. "Come on, Patsy," he whispered. "I know you like it. Jeffrey told us what you're like in bed, and I have much more than him." His smirk made me almost puke. I guess that would be one way to get him to let me go. But he was so caught up in kissing me again that he didn't remember that my legs were still dangling in the air. In this position, I couldn't apply much force, and it was not my knee, but my shin, but it was enough. As soon as I touched him, he let me go, let me go. He bent over for a few seconds, and then, straightening up, hissed, "Oh, that's how it is. You like it when it's rough, right?" And when I turned away from him, he continued, "Do you want?" But he fell silent when I spun around and found myself with a very large kitchen knife, which, I can honestly say, I was ready to use at that moment. "Try something like that again," I growled, trying to catch my breath. "And first go to the hospital, then to the police." A momentary expression of furious anger appeared on his face, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by a slightly crooked smile, which was much more scary, and I gripped the handle of the knife even tighter, but he did not take a single step in my direction. "You're a fool," he said quietly. "You don't have the slightest idea, do you?" This confused me a little, but he continued. "You lost it, Patsy. If you don't understand, there is only one real man in this company." And when I was about to say something, looking at him with contempt, he added, "Why don't you ask Marjorie? She'll tell you everything. And she should know, because she's tried all three of us. Many times." Something like pity flashed across his face, but only for a second, because he turned around, opened the door, and returned to the others, shouting, "And hurry up with your food." The only word I can use to describe my state is emptiness. I can't even describe all the thoughts that were running through my head. First rejection, then acceptance and rejection again when I realized the magnitude of what he said. Even though I had gotten over the shock, I knew I was unable to think clearly at that moment. I needed to leave. I went into a small corridor and took my coat off the hanger. Without thinking, I entered the living room and announced, "We're leaving." "What? It's too early," Bob argued, and incredibly, my husband supported him. "Well, come on, darling. We need to play at least 2 more games. Bring food, have another drink, relax." I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and my anger began to boil over very predictably. "This beast," I said, pointing at Calvin, "tried to seduce me. Use me, whatever you want to call it. So if you think I'll stay in this house for even a minute, calm down. He didn't mean anything by it. He just—" My husband ventured to say, but was interrupted by Bob. "Relax, Patsy. It's not such a big deal. We're not leaving until we've eaten and—" "Okay, whatever you want," I shouted, knowing that the keys were still in my pocket. "Stay if you want, but then you'll take a taxi home." I turned around and walked down the corridor towards the exit. As I opened the door, I heard Jeffrey shout, "Patsy, come back. Be reasonable, okay?" I slammed the door very contentedly as I left. When I got into the car and started it, I prayed that I wouldn't get stopped on the way home, but at the same time I wasn't too worried because I felt surprisingly sober. Like most teachers, I was well aware of the nickname my students gave me. They called me Frosty, which was partly due to my real name, Mrs. Snow. This nickname, I guessed, arose not only because it sounded like my last name, but also because of the special way in which I could control the atmosphere in the classroom. My colleagues often joked that my gaze could turn boiling water into ice in 5 seconds, if only I decided that was enough. With this look, I could achieve what many teachers could not. With one movement of my eyes, turn a noisy class into a silent and obedient mass. I used it with caution, but I knew for sure that it worked. There were times when an experienced male teacher, with a remarkable reputation and ability, could not cope with discipline in the class, and then, entering the room, I would restore order with one glance, not a single word, just a subtle but deadly accurate look. This look was my secret weapon, and I carried it like an invisible shield. That's the look I gave my husband when I found him sitting at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning after the card game incident the night before. He was, as always, in pajamas and a robe, the same ones that I, angry and tired, threw on one of the single beds in the spare room. On the table in front of him was a cup of coffee with a dark liquid splashing in it, and I could swear that he was not at all happy about this coffee, at least judging by the expression on his face. When I returned to our rented 2-room bungalow the night before, I could still taste Calvin's whiskey-scented breath in my mouth. So I spent a lot of time brushing my teeth and then took a shower to wash away the memories of what happened. Reading stories, I never understood why so many people put locks on their bedroom doors, so I had to put a chair in the handle so no one could get in. I thought about locking the front door, but that would be a waste of time, since Jeffrey never leaves the house without his keys. But I definitely wasn't going to let him sleep in the same bed as me. I heard him come home a little over an hour after I got settled. Considering that a taxi could take 20-30 minutes on a Friday night and another 15 minutes to get there, That left over an hour during which I imagined the three men would discuss how to mitigate the consequences of what had happened. Besides the fact that I was angry with him, I was also annoyed with myself. I'm usually quite perceptive and quick to grasp the essence of things, so I was not happy that I allowed our cozy home world to blind me to what was happening. Of course, there is always the possibility that it was nothing significant. I spent the first hour of the day thinking about it, wondering how likely it was that Calvin had simply lost his temper at being deprived of his reward. But on the other hand, there was my husband's reaction. He showed not the slightest concern at seeing his wife being attacked and grabbed, which coincided with his indifference to my previous complaints about Calvin's behavior, and the conversation with Bob when he stated that Calvin had a thing for married women, and, as I now suspected, that backhanded comment that he knew everything if Calvin tried anything with his wife. So while there was no direct evidence, there was a lot of circumstantial evidence that indicated that the card nights were, or had become, an elaborate cover for something completely different. If so, then all four of them, the three men and Marjorie, were involved, and I needed to know more. But for now, I had to focus on my dear husband. "Sorry," he muttered. I was just pouring myself some coffee when I stopped for a moment and turned to him. I said nothing and tried to keep my face as neutral as possible, looking at him and using silence as a weapon. He couldn't hold my gaze for long. Not many people can when I accept that gaze, and went back to his coffee cup. "This is all?" I asked sharply, and I swear the temperature in the room dropped several degrees at the sound of my voice. "Look, I know I should have." "Well," he began again, still not daring to look up. "I meant I should have stopped Calvin. About him being with you. Well, it was. Well, I thought it was just a game. I thought you were just joking. And—" "Nonsense," I said, which made him raise his head sharply, because I very rarely swear, except for moments of passion, of course, when my tongue often gets out of control. But he still couldn't stand my gaze and quickly turned away. Then, after pausing to recover, he continued. "Look, Patsy," I said, "I'm sorry. I know Calvin can be a real threat sometimes, and I will deal with him. I promise. Listen, why don't we have breakfast and talk?" "Oh, do you want breakfast, dear?" If he had seen the look on my face, I'm sure he would have known better than to say yes, please. But he didn't, so there's food in the fridge. Cook it yourself, damn it. This was probably not what he expected to hear. He didn't even glance at me as I finished my warm coffee, but I'm pretty sure the door slamming made him wince, though probably not as much as the much more satisfying sound of the front door closing as I left the house. Then, of course, he had to hear the angry roar of the engine, followed by the screeching tires as I pulled out of the short driveway and sped down the road. It was all for show. As soon as I turned the corner and was out of sight, I slowed down to the speed limit. I had already decided that I needed to make him think that my anger was purely and simply due to his failure to protect me from Calvin's advances. I didn't say or do anything to make him suspect that I understood what was going on between the four of them. Even if Calvin did confess to him, I haven't given any indication yet that I'm taking it seriously. It's a happy coincidence that he'll think I was too drunk or stunned to notice, and it'll be a good card to play when the time comes. But for now, I needed someone to talk to, someone I could trust, and who could trust a girl more than her own mother, especially when the mom in our small town is more skilled at local gossip than most anyone else. It wasn't that she was passing on these rumors that would have cost her her job, but working part-time as a secretary at a local medical clinic. While she had to be careful, she knew a lot about almost everyone in the area. I didn't hide anything from her as we talked over a cup of tea in her little living room. She called it the living room because she thought it sounded better that way, and told the whole story. "Apparently you're talking about Marjorie Rushworth," she asked, frowning and pursing her lips in an expression of disgust. "The one who used to be Marjorie MacDonald." And when I nodded, she continued, "Well, Trish, she still insisted on calling me that my name is Patricia, even though everyone else called me Patsy. Can't say I'm thrilled with the company you're in." I was careful. I knew from past experience that if I asked anything else, I would get that tough, thin-lipped look that foreshadows a lecture about how she can't reveal confidential information even to someone she trusts. I also knew she was dying to tell me everything she knew, so I just said, well, Bob and Marjorie are Jeffrey's friends, actually. Bob is a plumber and I don't need to tell you about Bob Rushworth. She interrupted, and yes, her lips pressed into a thin line for a moment before she continued. They are at the Millington house almost every week, and I'm sure it's not to discuss world politics. I don't usually like gossip and try to ignore it, but the stories about the Millingtons and their way of life were more like local legends than mere rumors. Grant, the head of the family, was known as a real bull in every sense of the word, and his wife, Kirsty, had 2 convictions for selling sex. Not sure if this word is used in the same context in America, so let me clarify that it means offering sex for money and is a crime in the UK. Granted, that was a few years ago, and I thought they were now living on a mixture of social security benefits and, as the locals said, trafficking in illegal substances. Both of their daughters were at my school, one white, the other very black, and although it was never proven, they were strongly suspected of dealing drugs outside of school. This, of course, opened up a new perspective on my husband's card friends, but it was not enough yet. This doesn't mean that. I began, knowing that I wouldn't get far, because my mother had already turned on the story in full force. That's because you don't know about Marjorie, she said confidently, and again I waited silently, knowing that my silence would force her to continue. When she was young, Marjorie MacDonald, whatever she was called then, Mom continued, they called her Loop. This applied to her panties, you know. One sharp jerk. Anyway, she got pregnant a couple of months after she came of age, and her parents sent her to have the procedure done to get rid of the pregnancy. I know it's true because her mother told me. They lived 3 houses away from us. They were a good family, but they felt betrayed and disgraced by their daughter. They moved a few years ago, and I have no idea where they are now. But I know that Marjorie stayed in London after she got rid of the child and began working on the streets. Your father, may God rest his soul, told me that some of his friends went to the West Ham football game and they took her, paid, and had a good time after the match. Anyway, somehow she managed to catch Bob Rushworth. He brought her here, and since then she has lived in abundance. He's a pretty good plumber and works hard, but he's also a terrible sex fan. The number of times he tried to propose to women in the houses where he worked, well, you just wouldn't believe it. Isn't it just rumors and gossip, Mom? I asked. No, that's definitely not true, she answered hotly. When his company was installing new bathrooms on this site, he proposed to me. I couldn't contain my indignation. I mean, you never think that your mother might be attractive to other men, right? So I asked when this happened. About 10 years ago, Trish, she said. I was over 50 then, and he was over 30, but that didn't seem to stop him. He cornered me in the kitchen while I was making a cup of tea, and his hands were all over me like a sick rash. I tried to push him away. When your dad, bless his soul, came home, he forgot the thermos and went to pick it up. We were so busy making noise in the kitchen that we didn't even hear his double-decker bus stop right in front of the house. Anyway, and luckily there were no passengers on it. But your dad saw what was happening. Bob tried to say something like it was just a joke or something. But he couldn't because my Albert hit him. I didn't even know how strong your dad was until I saw this, because he was always such a kind man, as you know. But he just grabbed Bob by the back of his head and his ass, carried him down the hall, and threw him into the rose bushes in the middle of the garden. Well, the thorns on the roses quickly brought Bob to his senses. But Albert leaned over to him and said that if he even looked at me one more time, he would tear him off. Well, you understand what exactly. Your dad could be rude at times, something like that. God rest his soul. Stop catching flies, she suddenly ordered, and I obediently closed my mouth, realizing what she meant. But no wonder my jaw dropped. Not only did I learn a lot about Bob and Marjorie, but also about my mother. I always thought that she was a gentle and caring woman, but now I suddenly saw that there was something more hiding behind her back. Anyway, she continued, I can't sit here and talk all day. I need to go and get the chapel ready for choir rehearsal. I stood up from the chair, buttoning my coat, and at that time she added, "There's one more thing, Trish. If your stupid husband is involved with such people, then you need to take a health test. I can't tell you who exactly, but there are people in your area who do this regularly, and sometimes they have to get treatment." After that, I went to the countryside to organize my thoughts a little. I had already realized that my mother was very careful to avoid giving information related to her work, and I could not help but admire her subtlety in this matter. She also made an appointment for me to see a nurse, a friend whose discretion she could rely on to take my blood test on Monday lunchtime. I was very afraid of this, although I understood that it was necessary because I have a phobia of needles. But I remembered one mother of a student telling me, "Wait until you have children. Then your arm will get more shots than a cheap, easy-to-get woman." I wonder why this phrase came to mind. When I arrived at what was one of my favorite spots, high in the mountains overlooking a picturesque valley and a distant waterfall, I unwrapped the meat pie and chips I had bought along the way and opened a small bottle of dandelion and burdock. It was a rare treat, and I knew I would probably get heartburn, but I didn't care. Some things had already become clear. If Jeffrey had any sexual contact with Marjorie, if he deceived me, our marriage would end. There was no question about it. And if it turns out that he brought home any illnesses, instead of a simple divorce, usually a 2-year separation, I would start sorting it out. I don't mean physically, of course, but there are other ways. I still couldn't believe it, because not for a minute did I feel that something was wrong in our relationship. Without any pride, I thought that I coped well with the role of a housewife. Despite my full-time job, I was always ready to cook and clean, and if he sometimes helped me, I always expressed gratitude. That's how I was raised. Our activities in the bedroom may have slowed down a bit since those passionate days at the beginning of our time together, but they were still quite active. I might have been icy at school, but I certainly wasn't at home. I have never refused sex without a good reason, not because she just wanted to please her husband, but because she loved it. I even indulged some of his fantasies, buying the clothes he wanted me to wear and performing the roles he suggested, and then buying sex toys that we could use for my pleasure. I even agreed to a little soft bondage without showing how much I didn't like it, and when he found a site with stories about adventure wives, I helped him carry out the ones he liked, but only behind closed and locked doors. Now, of course, I realized that I should have thought of it when he started talking about it, and especially when, a few months ago, he asked if I had ever thought about actually trying something like this. At first I just laughed, but when he kept bringing it up, I eventually gave him the ice glare full on, and he knew he should never talk about it again. Did he really want this, I wondered? If so, then he turned to the wrong person. As much as I enjoyed sex, it was something I loved to do with my partner, and it was too personal, too important, and too precious to share with others. Now, however, it seemed like he felt differently, that there was a side to him that I didn't know, and that was the most painful thing. I knew what temptation was. I knew how easy it was to give in to him, because over the past few years, several men, and once even a few women, had made it clear that they liked me, and there were times when I felt my body reacting, but I always told my boyfriend about it. To my husband. I never hid anything, and that means I had nothing to worry about. This is how I dealt with any temptation. For the first time, I felt tears rolling down my cheeks. I'm not one to cry often, and I don't like women who can turn on that tap to get their way, but I was all alone on the hill and didn't have anyone to hide, so I let it flow for a while. In the end, she wiped her nose with a handkerchief, adjusted her makeup, collected herself, and took a deep breath, trying to focus on solving her situation again. My first step had to be to get evidence that, if he was doing something, what exactly I was still hoping for a small spark of hope. If he deceived me, then we had no future, that was for sure. But at the same time, I saw no reason why the others should go unpunished. For over 2 hours, I just sat there, occasionally starting the car to warm it up, while I tried to come up with a plan that would bring retribution not only against Jeffrey, but also against Marjorie, Bob, and most of all, Calvin. I thought about all sorts of things, many of them based on revenge, that I read about on the internet. My head was full of stupid stories about hiring private investigators, using electronic devices to monitor what people are doing, protecting 401k. I have no idea what it is, and all the other things I've read about. But this was a fantasy world, not real life. It started to rain, and I saw a few snowflakes among the drops. It still wasn't a good idea to drive down this narrow road if the weather got worse, so I started the car and drove home, still not sure what to do. I tried to focus on the realities. For starters, we didn't have joint bank accounts. We never saw the need for it. The rent for the bungalow was paid from my funds, the utilities from Jeffrey's funds, and everything else was also divided between us. If our marriage ends, there will be no financial problems to deal with. We had no children, so at that point, a divorce by consent would require 2 years of separation, or, if one party objected, 5 years. The basis for divorce may be inappropriate differences, since everything else such as adultery or violence is usually only mentioned in cases where division of property or financial support is involved. If this is my path, then everything will be much clearer than the road I am traveling on. When the seriousness of my thoughts hit me, I almost started crying again, but I took a deep breath, decided to be strong, and, a few minutes later, turned into our entrance. The house was empty, but I found a note on the kitchen table. It said that he had gone to watch the team he supported play against Plymouth Argyle, that he would probably have a couple of pints afterwards, and then ask if I wanted to go out for dinner. Everything was so ordinary, as if nothing unusual had happened. Again, I felt my anger rising, but this time I felt amazingly clear-headed as I made a decision about what to do. It was just after 3 o'clock, and I knew he wouldn't be back until 7, so I had plenty of time to get ready. After turning on the heating and making myself some coffee, I grabbed his laptop, opened it, and began my investigations. I'm far from a computer genius, although I use them regularly at work, but I knew that Jeffrey was even less savvy with it than I was. At first it was a little strange, because there weren't that many Macs at school, and the Microsoft browser he used was different, but I got used to it pretty quickly. The first thing I had to do was find his password, and it couldn't have been easier. It was simply decorator, the profession he chose when he first left school. Then I immediately went into his saved favorites, and it showed a lot. Apart from a few sites about sports, building materials, and a couple of humorous ones, all the others were very similar, and I couldn't believe how many there were. The words these sites entered were cheating wives, foul-mouthed wives, wife-sharing, and hot wife. But his browsing history showed that he most often searched for wife-watching. I even found some surveys that claimed that most men have such fantasies. It didn't take long to realize that this was a real obsession. I opened a few of the stories, skimmed through them, and discovered that other than the terrible spelling and grammar errors and the terrible lack of anatomy knowledge, they were all pretty much the same. The scheme was as follows. A husband and wife introduce fantasy into their intimate life in order to diversify the relationship. This works for a while. Then the husband brings up the issue of making it a reality even though he loves her. The wife is shocked and refuses at first, but eventually she is captivated by the idea and gives in. To Jeffrey's great surprise and delight, she becomes a woman of easy virtue. I never liked that word, and they live happily ever after. This may seem strange, but the truth is that my anger gradually disappeared. I just felt very, very sad. I understood that if this is what he wants, and if this is really so important to him, then we have no future. I reflected on our life together and wondered how long he had been hiding this secret. Of course, it was as long ago as the moment when he got a computer, because his browsing history showed that he had been looking for these stories all these 3 years. Was this always in his head? I thought. Were these thoughts with him when we first got married? Were they there when we said, "Leave everyone else" on our wedding day? The anger was returning, and I welcomed it. I needed this feeling to support me and keep me strong. Without thinking too much, I started looking through the contacts on my mobile phone. Teachers are rarely found in the phone book, because it causes abusive calls from both students and parents until I found the right number. He called for quite a long time, and I was almost ready to give up this idea when I heard Alexa's voice. "Hi, Patsy. Sorry, I'm in the shops looking for something for the evening. How can I help?" "Well, actually, it has to do with going out," I said a little hesitantly. "I mean, I don't want to be a burden or anything, but Jeffrey has something going on, and I just thought, don't. Do you want to come with us?" "Oh, that's great, Patsy. There are only 3 of us today, and we will be glad if you join. Please tell me you'll come. We'll meet at the Regency Bar at 7, and—" "Are you sure this is normal?" I was already starting to get nervous. I half expected her to say she had a date, or even half hoped she would, but Alex dispelled all doubts and indecision. "Of course, everything is fine. See you there. Listen, I need to go. There's a sale at Next. See you at 7. The phone went off, and I probably sat there for a while, with the phone to my ear, thinking about what, exactly, I was going to do. I was invited many times to join Alex and her friends for evenings, but I always declined because, as I said at the beginning, Jeffrey always seemed like a homebody, and I was content to spend evenings with him. From what I heard, Alex and her friend Susan could get a little wild sometimes, but the other 2 who usually went with them were happily married and just going out for company. After my second shower that day, I started looking for something suitable to go out. Most of my social outings were fairly formal, either related to my work or Jeffrey's, and neither the outfits I wore for those occasions nor the clothes for school were appropriate for a night out at the club with Alex and her friends. I wanted to look attractive, but of course not an easily accessible woman. There's that word again. And I certainly didn't want to seduce anyone too much or create false expectations. A little flirting was reasonable, but I had already decided that sex with anyone was off the table until I was tested for possible infections. In the end, I chose a black V-neck sweater, which was far from revealing, a fairly simple black skirt that barely reached the knee, with black tights, which I think is pantyhose for Americans, and black shoes on not too high a heel so that they are not uncomfortable. My underwear, for those who appreciate such details, was plain and black, nothing special. As I styled my hair and applied my makeup, I tried to figure out exactly what I was trying to achieve. The main goal was for Jeffrey to, of his own free will, tell me what really happened at his card game nights. My plan, if you can even call it that, was to disturb his thoughts a little so that he would tell everything himself. I was still so unsure of myself that I even called my mom and told her what I was going to do. She had a few doubts, but she understood and simply warned me to be careful, especially when I mentioned the names of 2 married women who usually went to these evenings. "You may find that they are not as innocent as they seem," she said, adding, "but this is not the place for me to say that." To be honest, it didn't help at all, but I couldn't push her any further. My nerves started to get the better of me, and I was almost on the verge of giving up on everything. In fact, I probably would have done so if the car horn outside had not sounded, signaling the arrival of the taxi I had ordered. I quickly went to the door, shouted that I would be out in a minute, then returned to the kitchen and took the note left by my husband. Below, where he wrote about having dinner together with an added G and an X next to it, I wrote, "I made other plans. Don't wait for me. Where the hell have you been so far?" was the greeting question I heard on Sunday afternoon. Jeffrey, I thought, must have been sitting and looking out the window, waiting for me to return, and probably saw me paying the taxi driver. He was ready and waiting for me in the small corridor, and the words came out of him as soon as I entered and closed the door behind me. I didn't answer as he examined me carefully, apparently noticing that I wasn't wearing a bra and my legs were bare. He may not have been the most observant husband in the world, but he knew me well enough to know that I would never go out on a night out without tights or a bra. He also had time to notice that my makeup was applied quickly and carelessly, and my long blonde hair was unkempt styled. "Well?" he demanded as I kept my eyes down and walked past him. "I was on the street," I replied, and, without looking back, headed towards the bathroom, adding, "You can put the kettle on if you want. I'll just take a quick shower. I didn't know how he would react as I closed the door and went inside. When I took off my watch and earrings and the only clothes I was wearing a skirt and a sweater, I could already hear him knocking on the door. Patsy, we need to talk. But by that time, I had already turned on the shower at full power, so I just shouted, I can't hear you. Make me some coffee. More. I'll be there soon. Then I stepped under the powerful stream of hot water, hoping it would help relieve the tension from my aching muscles. A hot tub would have been better, but our small bathroom didn't have room for one. As I finished and dried myself off, my nerves were starting to get the better of me, but realizing I couldn't back down, I took a deep breath and threw on the robe I'd left on the back of the door the day before. Jeffrey wasn't waiting outside as I expected. I heard his footsteps in the kitchen, so I went to the bedroom to use the hair dryer and comb my hair properly. I had just finished when I heard him ask where I wanted my coffee, and I answered, in the living room, making a final assessment of my appearance. Are my underwear plain and boring? Checked. Hair tied up in a tight bun? Checked. No makeup, a shapeless and unattractive robe, and ugly fluffy slippers with Minnie Mouse on the toes. Everything is in place. Let the psychological games begin, I thought. The living room was warm and cozy, with the curtains drawn and the lights dim. Jeffrey was sitting in a chair, sipping what I thought was a glass of his favorite drink. He tried his best to appear relaxed, calm, and in control, but his tension was palpable. Thank you, dear, I sang cheerfully, taking the cup of coffee he prepared for me, and, settling into the chair opposite him, nodded towards the blank TV screen and said, no sports for today? It sounded so much like a dog's fur and collar starting to rise that I half expected him to bark. But after taking a deep breath to control himself, he clenched his teeth and said sharply, I'm waiting for you to tell me where you were last night. And don't say it's at Mom's, because I called her. Now this, I thought, seems like an unnecessary use of a trump card. No wonder he rarely won at whist. I blew on the coffee as if it was almost boiling. In fact, it was not much warmer than warm, took a sip, and, without deliberately raising my eyes, answered. I came out, spent the evening with a few friends, okay? And stayed all damn night, he burst out with anger. Where the hell have you been? It's none of your business, I stated calmly, and then took another long sip of coffee. Not yours. I'm your husband, he shouted. I saw that he was already on the verge of a breakdown, so I answered, speaking in a low and measured tone. You're my husband, right? Well, maybe we have different ideas about this. I would expect someone who calls himself my husband to come to my defense when some disgusting guy tries to touch me. In fact, I would expect my husband to intervene when I was in clear danger of being used. Is that too much, don't you think? Or maybe it makes more sense for the husband to just smile and take a beer, and the criminal himself will continue his business while he goes off to tend to his manhood. Okay, I added this purely on a guess, but the way he blushed with embarrassment showed that I had hit the nail on the head. You're exaggerating, was the best answer he could muster, and even that was a barely audible mumble. He tried to get his line of questioning back on track, apparently not in the way he expected, by saying, Anyway, we're talking about you, and what you did last night. Is it true? Okay, I said. What if I told you that I called Calvin and went to see him? What if I told you that we had sex in every possible way? Okay? What if I told you this? I would know that this is not true, he said confidently. About? How are you so sure? I asked. Because Calvin was here, Patsy. We went to the match, had a beer, and then he came back here. He slept on the sofa. Why? I thought you were going to dinner. If you expected this, why did you bring Calvin here? Don't know. Maybe he wanted to apologize, you know. Maybe he wanted to say that he regrets what happened last night. How should I know? I had never seen Jeffrey so confused and nervous as he was at that moment. He fidgeted, stared at the blank TV screen, and then, with a trembling hand, reached for a bottle of rum to pour into a glass. You know how they say, my blood froze? I had never thought about this expression, But once all the details came together in my head, I understood what it meant. He was waiting for me? Really? I barely managed to say. I watched as Jeffrey shook his head, watched as he struggled to find words, but all he could get out was a very hoarse, "No, of course not," before he took a very large sip of the brown liquid. But now I understand everything. I could imagine the two of them, maybe a little tipsy, deciding that it would be a good idea to try to make peace with me. Calvin probably insisted that he wanted to tell me personally that he didn't mean to offend me and didn't mean it that way. What he said, and then they found the note and everything changed. Calvin, because I had no doubt that he was the initiator of all this, saw a chance for something more. I could imagine him imagining me coming home after perhaps having too much to drink. He was right, and knowing that Jeffrey wouldn't interfere, he could bully me into submission. I felt my stomach clench at the thought, but my husband just stared into his glass, as if it held the answer to all the mysteries of the universe, and the silence continued until I couldn't stand it anymore. "You cowardly bastard," I said very slowly and saw him flinch, as if he had been shot in the back. "You were sitting here with this animal. You were waiting for me to return, and you were ready to let him. No, watch him. Get intimate with me. You were, weren't you? Well, answer me, you pathetic devil." "No," he suddenly shouted, throwing the glass, which broke with a loud clang in the empty fireplace. "This is wrong. He was sure you just needed a little gentle persuasion. He said that he sees that you really want him, that you need." And then the burst of anger died down as quickly as it had arisen, and he sank back into his chair. I had to push away the unwanted thought that the broken glass was part of the set my students gave me for my wedding. It's amazing what thoughts come to mind when you're stressed, and focus on the essence of the matter. So, while I was having fun with my friends, I said, trying not to sound too angry in my voice, "You helped Calvin ambush me." "No, it's not. I mean," he creaked quietly and then said, "You don't understand, Patsy. You just don't understand." At that moment, I felt complete contempt for the man with whom I spent 5 years of my life. In fact, I couldn't recognize the person I fell in love with. Was this the husband to whom I entrusted all my hopes, dreams, and ambitions, the man to whom I gave complete freedom to enjoy my body, and whose body I so joyfully accepted into mine? These thoughts suddenly made me feel a chill creeping across my skin, and it was difficult to bring my thoughts back to the present so that everything would finally come together. "What influence does he have on you, Jeffrey?" I asked, trying to keep my voice as calm and even as possible. "Nothing. No, it's not like that. This is—" He began to speak, but his voice was completely without conviction. "Please, Jeffrey, I can't help unless you tell me the truth. And I can't stay here if I'm under threat of attack. Or worse, from Calvin." I gave him time to process what I was saying, but when it didn't produce any response, I sighed loudly, theatrically, and said, "Okay, if you can't tell me, and I know you won't protect me, you leave me no choice." And I started to get up. "Where are you going?" "I'm going to pack my bag and go to my mom," I told him, trying to put deep disappointment into my words. "You can't. Please, Patsy. Don't. You can't do this to me," he said. His voice became aggressive, and he followed me into the bedroom, saying, "Oh my God, you didn't even tell me where you were last night. Does it matter? Are you kidding me?" he shouted this time. "When you come home with no bra, no panties, no tights, with a huge love bite on your neck, and you immediately go to the shower as soon as you get home." "It's quite a little love bite, actually," I corrected him, taking out my bag and starting to put clothes in it, glad that my appearance was effective enough to have him rummage through the laundry basket, checking to see if there were any panties in there. Another good card lost. "Anyway, if you decided to keep what's going on between you and Calvin a secret, then everything that happened last night will remain my secret, okay?" By this time, I had already filled my bag with clothes, so I took off my robe and started putting on my turtleneck and pants. As I fussed, he kept pleading with me to be smart, until I put my lotions and creams in my bag. Then I went to the bathroom and came back to say, I only took a toothbrush, a comb, and pills. Mom will give me everything else. I think it was the way I waved the half-empty bottle of pills that got to him. He tried again to beg me to stay, but it was a futile effort. Listen, Jeffrey, I said as I reached for my coat. As long as Calvin has this power over you, whatever it is, I can't feel safe here. You have to understand that. When you tell me about this, about what's between you, maybe we'll have a chance to work things out. And then I'll be ready to tell you what I did last night. But not before. Okay, he almost screamed, and then, pausing to calm down, he added, I'll tell, but you have to tell me first. I laughed, of course, because it sounded like the typical arguments I heard in the schoolyard almost every day, with us passing the buck on to each other, until I eventually came up with a compromise that I planned to use. Okay, Jeffrey, I agreed, unwittingly falling into the tone I often used with some of my more difficult students. If that's what you need, I'll start. But here's what I'll do. I'll tell you the simple truth about the first part of my evening, and then when I get to a certain point, I'll tell you when I'll stop. He looked puzzled and clearly worried, which I couldn't blame him for, so I hastened to add, and then I'll give you two completely different versions of what happened after that, without telling you what actually happened. But, what? Then if you tell me the truth, we can work things out and... Not sure. I don't think that. He tried to say, but I insisted that it was a simple yes or no question, and I knew that he could not refuse, because, for the first time, I saw how much he weak. 15 minutes later, we were sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, both with cups of freshly brewed coffee. He tried to persuade me to unwrap the bag, but it remained on the table in the hallway. Like I said, if he tries to break his promise, or if I suspect he's lying or hiding something, I'll leave. Okay, well, I started. We all met at the Regency bar and... who are we? Oh, right. Sorry. Well, there was Alexa. She is a fairly new teacher at the school, and she is still young. She's quite attractive, but a little wild, and she wears clothes that scream, "Come and get me," if you know what I mean. In fact, she had already been reminded a couple of times about the dress code at school. Then there was her friend, Susan. She works in a law firm. She's about my age, but looks a lot like Alexa, a real party girl, and she loves attention. They are both free, they can do whatever they want, and they probably take full advantage of it. Another member of our group was Muriel. She's a year or two older than me, and she's married. Well, she was married, but she's now divorced from her husband. Muriel, Jeffrey gasped, a look of absolute horror on his face. You don't mean... That one, I smiled, trying not to look too smug and hoping I hadn't played too strong a card too early. The same lady who left Calvin and tried to return to her husband when they started talking about divorce. I saw his face darken, and he began to worry, as much as I already know. She felt that she had played the card correctly, but she allowed him to delve into these thoughts, continuing to fulfill his part of the agreement. Yes, she moved into an apartment when her husband kicked her out. She's doing okay with money as far as I can tell. She's a certified public accountant and makes good money. But I think she's a little lonely now that she realizes there's no going back in her marriage. Anyway, we had a bottle of white wine at the Regency and then got into a taxi and went into town. We started at Queen's, then moved to Prince of Wales and ended up at Murphy's Bar. I drank white wine in pubs because I knew I had to be careful with the pace. You know, it was really great. I hadn't had a girls' night out in a long time, and I loved the chatter and the whole atmosphere. Anyway, while we were at Murphy's, before we decided which club we'd go to, both Alexa and Susan made it clear that they were going to meet later. It was just so Muriel, and I wouldn't have to worry if they suddenly disappeared. I thought Muriel looked a little wistful when they said that. I think she already realized that I'm not looking for adventure. We left a little after 11, to get there before the lines started outside the clubs, and were able to get into Diamonds and get a table before it got too crowded. But, oh God, Have you been to such places recently? No, of course you weren't. But let me tell you something. I'm not yet 30, but I felt like a grandmother there. Everyone is so young. They say you can only get into the club if you're 21, but okay, so we grabbed another round of drinks and Alexa and Susan immediately went dancing. Muriel and I tried to chat, but the noise was incredible. Honestly, it's a wonder someone hasn't gone deaf. The problem is that when you just sit and watch, you drink your drinks too quickly. And I know I drank more than I should have. To make matters worse, drinks kept appearing in front of us because guys who were hitting on Alexa and Susan were forcing them to send us drinks. Of course, the girls made us get up and dance several times, but the dance floor was so tight that it was almost impossible to move. Although, they did touch my ass a couple of times, but I didn't see who it was. I remembered with a smile. It was late, and the drinks probably relaxed me a little, but I was definitely having fun. We were left alone, the others probably met, when the DJ announced last order. I think it was about 3, because at 5:30 they drove everyone away. I was dancing, not with anyone in particular, just with a group of girls, giving it my all on the dance floor when they started playing some slow numbers to end the night. The crowd began to thin out, and I was about to leave the dance floor when I heard someone say, "Well, if it isn't Miss Frosty herself, what are you doing here, Patsy?" And when I turned around, I saw Jimmy Murdoch. I don't know if you remember him, but you met him at several school events when he taught physical education. He was this big, handsome guy with a soft Irish accent. No, well, he left for another school when he was offered the position of head teacher. So we started dancing. This was the first time I was happy to let another man hold me since you and I started dating. He said he was with a bunch of the rugby team, but they somehow ditched him, and we danced and chatted about old times, and then he walked me back to the table. And then I discovered that all the glasses had been removed, and Muriel was nowhere to be found. I paused in my story and looked at how Jeffrey was taking it. To be honest, it was hard to tell. He looked a little worried, but it was also clear that he was interested, perhaps even excited by what I was telling him. And this is where the simple truth ends, I told him. Now I will begin to tell you 2 different versions of what happened during my evening. Are you ready? Do you want me to continue? Do I need something stronger than coffee? He asked with a nervous half-laugh. A shot of rum would be nice, I suggested, and waited until he calmed down before continuing. Okay, I said, taking a deep breath to control myself, knowing that both stories had to be equally convincing. This is the first version. But remember, don't judge it until you've heard both. I will tell this as a story, I said, and I don't want any interruptions or questions. If something upsets you, tell me and I'll stop. But if you do, I won't continue. I'll just leave it the way it is. Fits. He nodded, clearly more nervous than before, and after a couple of moments I began. So the Diamonds nightclub was about to close. Muriel disappeared, and I was left with Jimmy. I looked at the empty table in confusion and, embarrassed, tried to figure out what to do. I knew I had some money in my purse, which would usually be enough for a taxi home. But between midnight and 6 there was a double fare, and I knew that wouldn't be enough. Then I heard Jimmy say, "Looks like we're both on our own, huh?" And then I suddenly realized that I was holding his hand. "How are you going to get home?" he asked when I let go of his hand and began to rummage through my small bag, hoping that there would be at least another 10 hidden among the small things and cosmetics that I took with me. But besides the 5-ton note, I found only small change, which would not even be enough for £1. I was going to take a taxi with Muriel, and to be honest, I was planning on being dropped off at my mom's. I had her spare key, so I could spend the night there and teach you a lesson. I don't know what time you called her. It was almost 1, he interrupted, momentarily forgetting about the no interruption policy. But I was expecting that too, and let him chat for a bit before adding, "She was really mad at me and told me not to call her again. I still took a chance and called later, but I think she left the phone off the hook." Great, I thought. The only card he had, and he just let me beat it. "Anyway, forget it," I said, trying to sound annoyed. Do you want me to continue? He nodded and apologized, and I continued. Jimmy offered to lend me some money, but I couldn't agree because I didn't know when I'd see him again. So after a little hesitation, we decided to split the costs. The plan was this. He would drop me off first, and then make sure that I had enough money to get to my mother. But the problem started as soon as I was outside, in the cold, fresh air, and the alcohol started to really affect me. I felt really bad, started to wobble, and then I vomited. I had a bit too much to drink, so I guess it wasn't a surprise. But it's a good thing Jimmy was with me, because all the taxi drivers in the rank saw it, and I don't think they would have agreed to take me if I was alone. Even the person driving us wasn't too happy, but at least I didn't throw up again. The problem was that it's a pretty long drive to Jimmy's house, about 10 miles south of here, and I breathed such a sigh of relief that, somewhere along the way, I must have just leaned against him and fallen asleep. Actually, no, forget it. I didn't just fall asleep. I lost consciousness, and everything I know about this next stage was told to me later by Jimmy. According to him, when we got to his house, he tried in every possible way to wake me up, but all he got was incoherent nonsense, and I passed out again. The taxi driver, of course, was not ready to take me in such a state. He said something like this had happened to him before, and when he tried to push the woman out of the car, she suddenly started screaming that he was trying to have sex with her, and her neighbors called the police. So by that time, the taxi driver was no longer particularly cooperative. He absolutely refused to take me to Mum and then back to Jimmy, even after promising him a big tip, because he said he was tired. It was his last flight, and he wanted to go home, and his house was in Heather Lanes. In the end, I guess there was no point in arguing, so Jimmy just picked me up and carried me to his house. I have vague memories of being laid down and covered with a blanket, and then passing out again. I don't think I slept for long, because when I woke up, I really wanted to go to the toilet. It was still dark. It felt like I was in the middle of a nightmare, the kind where you can't quite tell if you're awake or still asleep, and I remember trying to figure out where the bathroom was. That's the problem when you're used to living in a bungalow. You forget about the top floor. In the end, despite my foggy state, I somehow figured out how to get there, and only God knows how I managed to climb the stairs without making a noise or falling and breaking my neck. Unfortunately, it was a little late, because I peed a little in my underwear before I could take them off. I know I took them off. Well, obviously, but I have no idea what happened to them. They're probably still somewhere in his house. The next thing I remember was waking up with a terrible headache, naked, and all alone in a king-size bed. Jimmy later said that he heard me shuffling around in the bathroom for quite a while until the flush went off. And then, a few seconds later, I staggered into the bedroom, took off the rest of my clothes, and crawled under the covers. Honestly, I don't even remember how I did it. You can't even imagine how ashamed I was when he told me about this. And it didn't help at all when he said how hard it was for him to resist. It turned out that he had been eyeing me for a long time, ever since we started working at the same school, although before he didn't even let me know. So when I suddenly undressed like that and climbed into his bed, I think he decided, well, you can probably imagine what he might be thinking. But the thing was, he held his own, and actually behaved like a true gentleman. Once he was sure I was asleep. By the way, do I really snore loudly when I'm drunk? Okay, forget about it. When he realized that I was sleeping, he quietly slipped out of bed and went downstairs. He spent the entire night on the love seat that he initially put me on. God, how he did it. I'm 1.60 m tall, as you know, and he's much taller, over 2 meters, and quite strongly built, so he must have been quite uncomfortable, and I can't imagine him getting any sleep. Well, I had just woken up and was still a little confused when I heard a knock on the door and his voice asking if I could come in. I could hardly refuse, right? This is his bedroom in his house. So I said yes, or rather, I moaned something similar to it. And I must say that the situation was very strange. By this point, I was acutely aware that I was naked and pulled the covers up so that only my face and fingers were visible. When he walked into the room with a big smile on his face and a cup of coffee in his hands. "It's cold today, isn't it?" he said, and although it was corny, I couldn't help but smile back. He was wearing pajama pants, but no shirt, and my gaze involuntarily drifted from his joyful smile to the curly hair on his chest, and, to be honest, to his perfectly toned muscles. He's big and wide, but doesn't carry an ounce of excess fat anywhere. I watched him as he carefully placed the cup on the cabinet next to me and asked why he didn't drink himself. He replied that he had already drunk 2 glasses while he was waiting for me to wake up. I didn't realize until now that it was almost noon. Being the gentleman he was going to leave me alone, but I wanted to know what happened that night. I could understand that nothing happened between us, but I needed to know how I ended up naked in his bed. While he was explaining what happened, I heard him confess his feelings to me for the first time. I'm not sure how many times he said, "If I didn't know you were married." But there was definitely more than one. I eventually found out that he put my clothes in the washing machine because there was vomit on them and they weren't ready yet. He said I could take a shower, that there were fresh towels and one of his old robes in the bathroom, and that he would wait for me downstairs. After he left, and I heard him come down the stairs, I drank coffee, took a shower, and put on a robe. He was simply gigantic. If he wore it at full length, one can only imagine what happened to me. I probably looked kind of ridiculous, but at least he had my back. I headed back to the bedroom to grab my watch and earrings, which I had left there while I showered. I was already feeling much better, but as soon as I turned to leave, I must have stepped on the hem of my robe and lost my balance, staggered a little, and fell face down, half on the bed, half on the floor. This apparently caused a bit of a ruckus, because he immediately rushed upstairs shouting, "Patsy, are you okay, Patsy?" I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Well, I wasn't hurt or anything, but how stupid I was. That damn robe was wrapped around me, and I fought to get out and get back on my feet. But by then he was already in the room, lifting me up like I weighed nothing and carefully laying me back on the bed, even though I continued to protest that everything is fine. But all this time something strange was happening to me. I didn't understand what it was at first, but I think it had to do with his strength. How easily he could pick me up, like a doll, and then put me back so gently. It made me feel helpless, but at the same time, how to explain, so safe and protected when he held me. And there was also this wild, animal smell from him that drove me crazy. It sounds stupid, but he was so courageous that I really felt the temperature in my body rising. Without even realizing what I was doing, I wrapped my arms around his neck as he picked me up. And then when he laid me on the bed and tried to move away, I just held on to him. I couldn't let him go, Jeffrey. I felt too confused and depressed. He tried to carefully pull away again, but I couldn't let him go. Our eyes met, and I saw desire in him. I heard him say quietly, "Patsy, you're married. We shouldn't." But I couldn't hear those words anymore. I only needed him. I whispered, "Just pretend I'm not, please," and brought my face up to his to kiss him. I saw him struggling with himself, but in the end he gave in. His lips met mine, and everything inside me seemed to flare up. It was irresistible, swift as a storm. Everything that happened next was so stormy and emotionally intense that I could barely comprehend my actions. It was pure desire, uncontrollable by any reason. His every gesture gave me an incredible feeling of closeness and joy. These moments were like in another dimension. There was nothing, no time, no obligations, no restraint. I just remember feeling incredibly alive, as if a fire was burning inside me, making me forget about everything. After it was all over, I lay next to him, feeling incredibly warm, and I thought that I didn't want to lose this feeling anymore. But when I woke up and saw the time almost 4 in the morning, I panicked. He was sleeping when I quietly slipped out of bed and ran downstairs. My clothes were still in the wet washing machine, and I spent too much time trying to find them. Some things I never discovered, while others had to be left behind. I ended up dressing in what I could find and leaving the house feeling completely lost. I called a taxi, hoping to get home unnoticed. While I was driving, I tried to put myself in order so that you wouldn't suspect anything. But you were waiting for me. I stopped to look at my husband. The entire time I was talking, I was watching him closely. His reaction confirmed my suspicions. There was no trace of anger, which would be the natural reaction of a loving person. His gaze betrayed tension and, oddly enough, excitement. He moved several times as if trying to relieve the discomfort, and I quickly realized what was going on. His embarrassment became apparent when I asked him to bring me a glass of lemonade. When he stood up, his condition was impossible to hide. I watched him as he poured me a drink and saw him trying to collect his thoughts. When he returned, his gaze was full of mixed emotions. He finally spoke. "This is just the first version of what happened, Jeffrey. If you want to stop right there and believe that it's true, well, that's your choice. But I would prefer that you hear an alternative account of what I did that night." His face fell, and I could see him struggling to make a decision. When he finally nodded and returned to his seat, I noticed his tension ease slightly, although I didn't have to say anything to know how he felt. I felt something warm inside as I told my story. "If you're ready," I said, "I'll start with what happened next. This is a very short part, but by the time I'm done, I'll be gone. You have to tell me everything about yourself and Calvin." "Fine." He nodded silently again. I saw his face darken when he realized I was talking about Muriel, Calvin's recent acquaintance. This must have added to his sense of vulnerability. I felt the tension in his ease, and perhaps the knowledge that he could no longer hide anything had an effect on him. "Okay," I began, "so Jimmy and I left the dance floor." No wonder Muriel has already left. I talked to her a lot, and she opened up to me a little when she found out who I was and how I was related to Calvin. But I won't go into details. You can tell me yourself when it's your turn. But believe me, it was a revelation. I felt that my words and gaze were warming him up, as if the same moment was in front of me again. Jimmy and I stood in the cold, waiting for a taxi. He hugged me to warm me up. I, in turn, pressed myself against him. We talked for a while, and the laughter that escaped me seemed to lighten the atmosphere. Then, without expecting it, we kissed. It was an unexpected, spontaneous gesture, but so pleasant that I could not forget it. I didn't plan for everything to happen like this. It was just exciting. It's even a little strange, because he had a beard. But weird in a good way, you know. I fell silent, and then, lowering my voice slightly, continued. We both laughed a little when we got into the taxi. It was like returning to my teenage years, exciting and a little naive. We continued talking and laughing, and yes, I liked it. I wasn't going to change anything, but here it is. I paused before moving on to the next part. The taxi was driving, and we continued to hug. At some point, Jimmy became more insistent, but I didn't try to stop him. There was nothing offensive or too pushy about it. He just tried to be close, and I didn't resist. It was nice, although I understood that the situation went beyond ordinary communication. I didn't want to go into detail because it could change the perception of the conversation, and I needed him to understand that the main thing for me was not what was happening physically, but how I felt at that moment. But finally, we have arrived. I realized that I needed to take a step back before things went too far. I explained to Jimmy that I was married, and although it didn't ease the tension, he was understanding. Of course, he hoped that everything would end differently, but we laughed and agreed to remain friends. Still, I was glad that we were able to talk like human beings and end the evening without unnecessary expectations. He had a spare bedroom, but it had been converted into an office, so he offered to sleep on the couch and let me sleep on his bed. But since the sofa was only a two-seater and he was well over 6 feet tall, I couldn't let him settle down there. So he brought an extra pillow and blanket, and I thought he kissed me tenderly on the forehead before going to his room. It seemed like it was about 5 o'clock, and strangely enough, I fell asleep instantly. Like I said, I woke up rushing to go to the bathroom, and like I mentioned, I didn't make it in time. After I freshened up, I didn't know what to do with the wet laundry, so I wrapped it in toilet paper and went to the kitchen to look for a plastic bag to take with me. I was still rummaging through the closet when I heard his front door open. In a panic, I hid the laundry in the trash can, not knowing what else to do. Actually, it was Jimmy. He came back with fish and chips for us for lunch. He put the food on the table, picked me up, and kissed me, saying that he wanted his house to always be like mine. It was very nice of him, since I probably didn't look my best, but he didn't let me do anything until I ate. He told me not to worry, but to eat before the food got cold. And I have to admit that I really liked the way we just sat and chatted. At some point, I realized that I was starting to panic, because I didn't intend to stay for that long, and when I realized what condition I was in, he quickly called me a taxi. We barely had time to exchange numbers and promised to keep in touch until the driver arrived. But he told him to wait and, picking me up, said that he wanted me to remember him exactly. And then he kissed me, so that my legs literally buckled. "What about the bite?" Jeffrey asked, noticing that I had finished my story. "Some guy on the dance floor trying to freshen up," I quickly replied. "It happens in clubs." After that, there was silence, and we just looked at each other for a few moments. But he turned away first. It was already late, and I half expected him to suggest leaving everything as it was, since we both had to work the next day. But he surprised me by raising his head and saying, "So it quote s all up to me now, isn't it?" When I agreed, he added, "I don't know which version to believe, Patsy, but I really want to understand. And the only way to find out is to tell you about Calvin." "Not just about Calvin," I interrupted, hoping that this would be my last card in the game. "I need you to tell me everything." Although the bottle of rum was almost empty while he listened to me, he continued to look reasonably sober. But when we looked at each other again, his shoulders suddenly slumped, and he sat down with an expression of defeat. "Okay, I'll tell you," he admitted. "I'll tell you everything. But I warn you that after I'm done, you might not want to talk to me. I hope you don't hate me for what I'm about to say, Patsy. Please don't hate me. I just can't hold it anymore." I had to ask him to wait while I quickly went to the bathroom. It was a needed break, but it also gave me some time to recover from the intense experience of telling him about my party. When I returned, he was already in the living room, and I didn't mind joining him, although now it was harder for me to look at his face. "I'm not as good with words as you are, Patsy," he began, "so if you want, interrupt or ask questions. You have to go back a little to understand what I'm going to tell you. Calvin and I have been friends since childhood. It's important that you understand the context. Cal was always a bit of a bully, especially during his school days. He was stronger and taller than all of us, and apparently I became his friend because it was easier than being outside his circle. We both left school as soon as we could, as academics were not our strong suit. Cal became a plumber, and I became a painter and decorator, although not the best at it. Soon after I received my diploma, I got a job as a salesman. So I'm still in this place, although the company where I work has long been owned by another, large company. Cal was more ambitious. He organized his team, and in general, we helped each other. He took over the contracts, and I helped him reduce prices. We both found some benefits for ourselves. Over time, his business began to grow, and he began hiring employees. We often spent time together on weekends. Cal had always been good with women, and he already had his own place to invite someone to. He knew how to find a common language with anyone, and to be honest, I didn't find myself in such situations as often as he did. But be that as it may, I was luckier than if I was alone. But the problem was that he believed that he had a right to any woman I interacted with. If he liked her, he expected me to give in. And since this usually happens to him, I could only silently agree. Another thing about Cal was that he loved to show off. He often called me to his room so that I could see how he behaved with women, and if he managed to subjugate them to his desire, then he sometimes forced me to be a part of it. This happened quite often. That's why I was so nervous when I first met you, Patsy. I fell in love with you right away. But Cal kept telling me not to get my hopes up. He said that you were arrogant, cold, and that perhaps you were even gay. I didn't know why he said that. I couldn't explain exactly why he said that because, to be honest, I had never met Calvin before I met Jeffrey. We were already married by then, and I could only assume it was because Cal saw how serious we were about each other and didn't want to lose his rival in the game. Anyway, we had a little fight about it, he continued. He moved to new premises near the city and conducted most of his business there for a couple of years. Of course, he still dealt with our company because I gave him benefits. You know, for example, when there was a shortage of 15 copper tubing, I kept it in stock so he could keep working when others were having difficulty. That sort of thing. It was when you were so busy getting your master's degree that he seemed to be in the middle of things again. That's when he bought himself this house, and because you were so busy in the evenings, I started spending a little time with him in the pub. It didn't take long to realize he hadn't changed. The only difference was that he became more interested in married women. I don't know why. Somehow, he got to the point where he needed to see the engagement ring on the woman's finger before making any moves. I thought he was used to being watched. At least that's what I thought for a while. But one evening, he invited me to meet him at his house for a beer. There was a big international match, and he said we could watch it quietly, drink some beer, and order pizza. It seemed like a good idea, much better than jostling to see the screen in the pub and listening to all the experts tell us what the manager was doing wrong. All that usual chatter. Plus, he had just bought a large flat-screen TV with surround sound, so I was looking forward to it. I arrived half an hour before the match started, but when I knocked on the door, a woman opened the door for me. I guess I looked surprised, but she grinned and said, "You must be Jeff." When I nodded, she simply stepped aside and walked past, saying, "He's there." I didn't even get a good look at her, but she seemed pretty slender. I was at a loss, not knowing what to do, and was thinking about leaving. But then Calvin called my name and said, "Come in." I walked into the living room and found that he wasn't fully dressed either. He was only wearing boxers and a t-shirt. He smiled broadly, pointed to a chair, and advised me to sit down to get a better look. I thought he meant the TV because I was just looking at it, and even though the sound was off, I could see the experts heatedly discussing what would happen next. Before I had time to sit down, the woman returned. She gave me a can of beer and a plate of sandwiches, then left again. I quietly asked Cal who she was, but he just grinned and said something about having fun during the break. Everything happened so quickly that I didn't have time to see the woman. I got the impression that she was slim and wore a very short skirt. But what I noticed was that she had a gold ring on her ring finger. When the match had already gone on for about 20 minutes, I heard her return. She stood behind me and asked how I was doing. Cal said he was bored, and that seemed to be a signal to her because she walked past me and sat down next to him. My embarrassment melted away the moment I realized that what was happening next to us was not an accident. This was planned in advance. We were all silent, watching what was happening, and I began to feel that this whole situation was some kind of strange test for me. My feelings were mixed: embarrassment, curiosity, the feeling that something big and incomprehensible was happening right in front of me. I couldn't take my eyes off. At some point, I felt my own emotions begin to control me. Cal noticed my reaction and chuckled, quietly telling me that I should relax because these things could be part of our experience. I didn't even know how to react to his words. They invited me to join, and I agreed. He paused for a moment and then said, "I think you've already guessed that it was Marjorie Rushworth." I didn't answer right away. He continued, sensing my reaction. When she left, I was in complete shock. I wanted to ask a question, but I restrained myself. My husband continued, barely keeping himself from looking too stressed. When they all left, Cal said that we would do this every week, and that I would have to meet them under the guise of playing cards so that you don't. I suspected. Then I felt that something important had been said, and I asked, "What about Bob and Muriel?" He paused for a moment before answering. Bob was always there, and Muriel actually came a couple of times. But it didn't matter. You know that I didn't care. I fell silent, feeling how everything in my head was turning over. And then he said, "I didn't repeat this with them. There was nothing else like that. But still, I felt that it was all strange and wrong." I exhaled and calmly said, So you were part of their game? Did you think I would like what they do to you? He didn't answer. I continued. You could have told me all this before, but I will never be able to forget it. Patsy, listen, please. Don't act like that. We didn't hurt anyone. We just didn't hurt anyone. I finally snapped. You cheated on me. Every fucking Friday night, the last one. It wasn't a scam, Patsy, he countered. Honestly, I've never done anything else. I swear. Are you not cheating? You sat and watched Calvin have sex with Muriel and Margie, and you. Every damn week you did it, and you have the nerve to say it's not a scam? I realized that my voice had risen to a scream, and I took a deep breath to control myself. I told you you'd hate me, didn't I? He said, and I saw tears in his eyes, but it was too late. I looked at him carefully, seeing nothing in the man I once loved enough to marry and spend my whole life with, and said in a quiet voice, No, I don't hate you, Jeffrey. I just feel sorry for you. I'm sorry. And I stood up to put on my coat, went into the hall and grabbed my bag, and he hurried after me. Where? When are you coming back? He asked. I'm not coming back, Jeffrey, I told him. Tomorrow I will go to a lawyer to start the divorce. I'll waive the rent on this place, so you'll have to figure it out if you want to stay here. And I'll make arrangements to come back with Mom sometime to pick up the rest of my stuff. And, please, Patsy, don't leave me, he begged. We can deal with this, honestly. We can. No, Jeffrey, we can't, I told him quietly. I'm not even criticizing what you did. If that's what you want, then fair enough. But with me, this will never happen. Let the divorce be easy, Jeff. It will give us both a chance to start over and live the life we each want. Only this time Calvin won't get in the way. It will all be over. I stepped out into the cold night air, threw my bag in the back seat of the car, and climbed inside. As soon as I started the engine and started to drive out, he suddenly came up and motioned for me to open the window. I did so, but only enough to hear what he said. You didn't tell me, he complained. What? Which version of your evening was the real one? That's why you'll never be a good card player, Jeff, I told him, because you'll never see when someone is bluffing. But which? None of them, Jeff. None of them, I told him honestly, and then headed towards my mom's house. Driving through the dark streets, I wondered if there was a teacher somewhere named Jimmy Murdoch who played rugby and behaved like a true gentleman. If he had, I would definitely never have met him. Jeffrey probably felt that I had deceived him, and to some extent, I suppose I did. At the same time, I was very careful and said that I would give him two completely different versions of what happened without telling him what the truth actually was. And that's exactly what I did. It's true that I danced at the end of the night, but it was with a drunk idiot who suddenly grabbed me and gave me a stupid love bite in the neck. I eventually managed to push him away, but he followed me back to the table until one of the guards saw what was happening and got rid of him. Muriel, as I said, has disappeared. Alexa and I took a taxi back because she had a fight with her boyfriend, drank a cup of hot chocolate, and she asked if I wanted to crash on her couch. The next day, we both slept late until almost 2 o'clock, and then sat and chatted until about 4. I called a taxi, but before I left, I went to the bathroom and took off my underwear. On the way out, I threw them in Alexa's trash can, and then on the way home, I ruffled my hair a little and made my makeup a little messy. Why did I do all this? Well, to put it simply, I wanted to make it seem like I was up to no good, because I thought that would be the best way to get Jeffrey to open up. And the stories about cheating wives from one of his favorite sites helped me with this, and that's why I, too, dove straight into the shower when I got home. I have no idea if real cheating wives do this, but Jeffrey didn't know that either. Should I have done this? The question was swirling around in my head, but I didn't want to answer it. Sometimes such decisions come not from reason, but from some deep intuition, from the feeling that it just needs to be done. Maybe in the end will justify the means, maybe not. But I knew one thing for sure. This step was inevitable, and I could no longer remain in the past without the strength to move forward. When I stopped near my mother's house, looking sadly at its familiar outlines, a strange feeling came over me. This was the same house where I spent so much time, where there was laughter, where there once was comfort and peace, but now only memories remain here. I was very sad. The bitterness of loss grew inside, and I realized that parting was not only the end of a relationship, but also an entire stage of my life, which I was never able to fully survive. I mourned the fact that I no longer had a partner, that I would now have to learn to be alone again. All those moments when I believed that we could fix everything turned into illusions. I was amazed that all the love, communication, even unlimited sex that seemed to connect us was not enough to help him overcome his internal barriers. This realization at some point became a heavy stone on my soul, and I felt like the world around me was starting to collapse. But standing here, near my mother's house, I felt how all this was gradually receding. I told myself, now I'm out of this, I did it. Although the words sounded quiet, their meaning was important to me. They were a reminder that, despite all the worries, I still made it. I've learned to let go. And although it was hard inside, and my heart was squeezing a little, I suddenly realized that now, at this moment, I was free. Free from old expectations, from people who could not understand me, free from the pain that had haunted me over the past months. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I quickly brushed them away, not allowing my emotions to take over me. I couldn't let myself drown in tears again. I felt light appearing on the horizon, a new path, a new life. I firmly decided that perhaps now I needed to look for someone like the Jimmy of my imagination, that ideal person with whom I could build real happiness, or at least try to find something resembling true love. Someone who would become my support, with whom I could live my life without losing myself. Maybe, if there is enough time, I will even be able to create the very family that I have dreamed of for so long. That family I always knew I wanted but could never find. I took a step towards the car, locked it, and as I looked back at the last moments of my past, I felt confidence begin to grow inside me. I didn't know what lay ahead of me, but I knew that this would be my life, and it would be filled with new meaning. I took a deep breath and took a step into the future that I will create for myself. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.